Hello and good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know, we are carrying lectures on different topics and different subjects. Today we would be talking on Sunyavada Philosophy. This lecture is in continuation with the previous lecture. The lecture has already been uploaded for you on YouTube, so it would be easier for you to recall what we have studied in the previous session. So, dear friends, taking the lecture forward, we would like to tell you all that for this very discussion on the topic, we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is teaching in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Let's welcome our guest, Dr. Ajay Verma, and let's try to understand more and more about Sunyavada Philosophy. Hello, sir. Welcome to the EduSet lecture.
So, welcome viewers. As you would remember, in the last lecture, we discussed about the different branches of Buddhism. We also discussed about the schism that was later on witnessed between two different groups within Buddhism. One of them is known as Hinayana, the other one is known as Mahayana. We also learned what are the main philosophical differences between the main tenets of these two schools. In that context, we learned that most the basic teachings of Buddhism are adhered to. There's no dispute about some of the basic tenets of Buddhism, which includes the notion of momentariness, the notion of Four Noble Truths, Dwadash Nidana Chakra, that is 12 link chain, and Ashtanga Marg. So on most the main teachings of the Buddha, there is not much dispute except regarding a little bit of interpretation of Pratityasamutpad. In that context, we learned that Mahayanist philosophers gave a somewhat sort of a very different interpretation of the notion of Pratityasamutpad, which is translated as dependent origination. So whereas Hinayanists, according to their Abhidhamma texts, there are some ultimate constituents, whether we talk about the mental world, whether we talk about the physical world, and they hold these ultimate constituents to be real. Whereas Mahayanist interpretation is that there is nothing at all in the world which which we could think of as having an essence of itself. The term for that used by them is swabhava. So, after having discussed that, now let's move further regarding the philosophical tenets of the Sunyavada philosophy. When it comes to Mahayana philosophy, it was one of the most prominent schools that we know within Mahayana tradition is Sunyavada. The Sunyavada philosophy has its origin in one of the very early texts, which is named as Pragya Paramita Sutras. Pragya Paramita Sutras is dated somewhere between 100 BC to 150 AD. And the author of this text is actually not known. So, according to the legend, Nagarjuna, who is supposed to be the main propounder of Sunyavada philosophy, came across this text. Actually, there are several stories, there are several legends, that do rounds amongst Buddhist philosophers regarding the exactly the way this text was discovered by Nagarjuna. So, according to one of those stories, Nagarjuna, who hailed from southern India, most probably from some part of Andhra, was very well versed in magic and other things, and this text was revealed to him by the king of snakes, and he really had to go down there inside the earth to bring out these teachings, but these are some of the stories which have to be which must be taken metaphorically. So basically, the point here is that these teachings were in some way esoteric in nature, and were understood by few. So there were only few people who could really understand these texts, because these texts basically, as the title itself suggests, this text talks about pragya. Pragya, which is the Sanskrit term for what we could call intuitive, higher understanding. So Pragya Paramita Sutra basically would mean verses on paramita, which would mean, in a certain sense, transcendental. So some sort of this term would refer to some sort of transcendental, we referred by the term para. Some kind of transcendental, intuitive understanding of reality. So that intuitive understanding is what the term pragya refers to. So the point here is that the teachings expressed in the text of Pragya Paramita Sutra was, in a certain sense, esoteric in nature, and was understood by a few. Now, the main contribution of Nagarjuna towards the philosophy, towards the philosophical thought that is propounded in Pragya Paramita Sutra is that he presented a different kind of interpretation of it, or he systematized it. He systematized the thought that is presented in Pragya Paramita Sutras in a way such that it becomes, more available for understanding to the philosophers of his day. So his main contribution was that since these sutras appear to be in certain ways, understandable only by few, so he re-systematized them. He systematized the teachings in a certain way that it could be understood by more number of people. And these teachings that he discovered in Pragya Paramita Sutras, he later on presents them in more systematized form in a number of texts. Some of them are Mool Madhyamaka Karika, which this title is roughly translated as fundamental verses on the middle way. Shunyata Saptati, meaning 70 verses on emptiness. Vigraha Vivartani, which means the end of disputes or the dispeller of disputes. Vaidyalaya Prakaran, which means pulverizing the categories. Vyavara Siddhi, which means proof of convention. This particular text is a little different in nature from the rest of them, since it tries to relate some of the Sunyavada thoughts to some of the ethical precepts that are propounded in Buddhism. The next one is Yukti Shashtika, which basically means 60 verses on reasoning. The next one is Chatushtava, which means hymn to the absolute reality. Ratnavali. Ratnavali is again very different kind of text, which is basically written in epistolatory form, which basically means that it's a kind of it's written in the form of letters to the king, and basically the main subject matter of this text is regarding how to run a state, how to govern a state. So these in this text Ratnavali, Nagarjuna gives certain suggestions to the king around his time. So these are certain suggestions regarding governance. The next one is Pratita Samutpad Hridaya Karika, meaning constituents of dependent arising. Sutra Samuchay, Bodhi Chitta Vivarna, which means exposition of the enlightened mind. Suhur Lekha, which is again a text very much like Ratnavali. It's also written in epistolatory form. So this is written in the form of letters to a friend. And the next one is Bodhi Sambhar, requisites of enlightenment. And the last one, but also probably the most important, the best known text of Sunyavada is Mool Madhyamika Karika, verses on the middle way. So, from the point of view of the philosophical thought that Sunyavadan philosophers uphold, from this point of view, probably the most best known texts are first of all Mool Madhyamika Karika, and the other one is Vigraha Vivartini. So we'll discuss these texts in a little bit more detail later on, maybe in the next lecture in this series. But for the time being, we'll talk about. We'll again sort of dwell a little bit more upon the Sunyavada philosophy as such. So now sort of focusing back again on what exactly is the central focus of Sunyavada thought. Before we begin with that, let's look at let's try to understand what exactly what are the issues that generally concern us in the discipline of philosophy. So some of the main concerns that philosophers bother themselves with are what constitutes the being of things. So what is what are the basic constituents of things? In other words, what constitutes the isness of things? What do we mean there when we say this thing is or this thing exists? Now, the term that is used for the reality, so to speak, of things, the Sanskrit term used for that is tattva. Now, the term tattva, understood as the constituent elements of objects in the world, could be literally translated as thatness. So, the literal translation of this term would be thatness, where the term tat stands for that. So, and the suffix va would stand for ness. So the term tattva basically refers to thatness of things. So what? One of the basic questions that we ask, as philosophers in the domain of philosophy, is what exactly is the thatness of things? What constitutes the whatness of things? So tattva mimamsa, which basically means, which is the word for metaphysics. So metaphysical inquiry that concerns philosophy as a discipline in a central way is the meaning of the term tattva mimamsa would be which means basically metaphysics. So here it would basically mean the study of whatness or thatness of things. So, when it comes to tattva mimamsa, meaning the metaphysics, the main question that we pose before ourselves as philosophers is what exactly, what constitutes the whatness, the thatness or thatness of the thing. So, what makes the thing what it actually is, or what it actually is supposed to be? So that is one of the main questions that concerns us in metaphysics. Now, the problem with one of the main problems that we confront when we try to approach this question, which has a huge metaphysical philosophical importance, is that when we raise questions regarding whatness or thatness of things, we are looking for some precise answers. We want to know what exactly is the nature of things, what exactly is the nature of the world, and it might sound like a metaphysical question, but this is what even pure physicists this is also the question that bothers scientists as inquirers. So when we ask this question, what we are looking for is the exact terms, the exact definitions, some kind of definite understanding of the world. Now, the problem that immediately confronts us when we ask such questions is that world presents itself to us with some kind of vagueness about itself, and this vagueness is pretty much it has it seems to be in a certain way adamant. I mean, in the sense that it seems to refuse to go. So, world does not seem to lend itself to any definite understanding of itself. Now, what do we mean when we say that world doesn't seem to allow, to lend itself to any definite understanding of itself? What we mean here is probably we could understand what we mean here by looking at some of the words which seem to have meaning for us, but on closer examination we'll find them to be a little sort of vague, if not nonsensical. So for that purpose, let's look at some examples. Let's look at some of the group nouns. Terms, some of the terms signifying group nouns, like heap, like pile. We talk about pile of things, heap of things. We like herd and so on. Now, somebody may ask, well, what's vague about these terms? We seem to understand pretty well what we actually mean by the term heap, or what we mean by a certain pile of things, and so on and so forth. Now, if we want to have some kind of an absolute, unequivocal, definite understanding of these terms, so somebody may just ask us, say, for example, if we talk about a heap of, or a pile of seeds of certain pulses or certain grain. Now, say for example, let's talk about grains of wheat. So now, if somebody asks us, give us the exact definition of pile of seeds of wheat. Now, we may say, well, haven't you ever seen a pile of or heap of wheat grains? We have, but to have a absolute definite understanding, somebody might ask a question: how many wheat grains should be there exactly for this thing to be called a heap? Now, if that kind of question is asked, probably we do not have a definite answers to it. There's no definition of heap like that. So somebody might wonder, would if there are just 10 grains or 15 grains of say 15 seeds of wheat, would this number be good enough for it to be called a heap? If somebody says yes, then if we take one more grain away, would it still be a heap? Now, these are some of the questions very difficult to answer. So, suppose after when there are sort of 10 grains, and if I take one more away, and the person says now we cannot call it a heap anymore. So that would mean that this 11th seed is what is what is central to the being of what we call a heap of grains. So now, which obviously would be an absurd conclusion to draw from this kind of argument. So the point that I'm trying to put forth here is that even though we seem to understand, sort of things through language pretty well. Things seem to make sense to us. But if we are looking for a kind of understanding, kind of philosophical understanding that bothers philosophers, then probably that kind of absolute understanding of things is very difficult, if not impossible, to arrive at. So when we start looking for such kind of absolute understanding of things, then we start finding that from that point of view the world is pretty vague. It comes across as something that has a lot of vagueness about itself, and no matter how much clarifications we keep seeking and we keep finding, this vagueness does not seem to go completely off. So this example, in a certain sense, in a certain way, brings forth the point to us that language, even though it seems to have absolute clarity about itself, it helps us understand the world, but on a closer examination we would find it to be unsuited for for philosophical explanation, for the kind of explanations that as philosophers we are looking for. For that matter, even if we talk about scientists, scientists also realize that after a particular point of time, it's the ordinary language, is no more the language which would capture the reality about things. So they would resort, or rather, after a particular point, after a particular limit, they would resort to mathematics as a different kind of expression of what they think is the reality about the universe. So the point here is that language, ordinary language that is, though seems to help us in understanding, in giving us a very clear understanding of the world, but philosophical questions are of a different order. And they require, therefore, an explanation of a different order, of a different kind. And when we enter into that domain, that philosophical domain, then ordinary language, starts there are sort of crevices that there are cracks that start appearing, within the ordinary language use. So, from this example of a heap, it becomes pretty clear to us that there are some words which we seem to understand, but on closer examination, we find that there could not be any definite understanding of these terms. But the next question is, that if things are if the things are vague insofar as they cannot be definitely delineated, as we just saw, are are sort of other things any better, in the sense that we just took the example of group nouns. But when we talk about certain other things other than group noun, do sort of conditions improve for us as philosophers trying to philosophize with the help of ordinary language. So, but on a closer examination, we will find that even for objects other than group nouns, the ordinary language doesn't seem to take us far enough. So, say for example, just like the group nouns, which are which represent coming together of entities of a certain kind. Now, when we talk about individual things, say for example, chairs, tables, and so on and so forth. Do things start appearing different to us? Does the philosophical problem that we are posing before ourselves, does it become easier for us to answer the same question? On closer examination, we'll find probably things don't improve much for us. Say, for example, if regarding other things other than group nouns, if we ask the question, what are things? Then probably, the sort of very common ordinary answer to it would be, well, things, are constituted of parts. They have certain constituents. And when those parts or constituents come together in certain proportions, we have, some kind of a working thing before us. So that's, some kind of a very ordinary, common understanding of what we mean by, objects in the world generally. But then, from the point of view of philosophy, there are, immediately certain other questions, present themselves before us. Say, for example, somebody might ask, are things identical to their parts? Are, things, just identical to their constituents? So answer probably to that would be no, because when we sort of look at things, say, for example, in the last lecture we talked about, and that's that famous story that we come across in in the text Milinda Panna, the questions of Milinda. So there we come across the example of a chariot. Is a chariot just identical to its parts, like axle, wheels, the seat where the person who's driving sits, and so on and so forth? Is it just identical to its parts? No, probably chariot is. As we understand it, chariot is more than something more than its parts. So therefore, like it's sort of its parts do not completely. I mean, the thing itself cannot be completely, absolutely defined, in terms of its parts alone. So that means things are not completely identical to their constituents or their parts, because when things come together, say, for example, so far we just talked about, for the sake of understanding, we talked about the physical things. In chemical equations, when two things come together, they make a third thing which may have a completely, entirely different nature. So, in those cases, it becomes even more difficult to say that the thing in question is completely identical to its constituents or its parts. So, if things are things are nothing but the constituents, elements that go on in the that go into the making of it, then the question that arises is, are things identical to its constituents or parts? The answer, as I just demonstrated, is no. Next question is, are things more than their parts? Probably the answer to that also would be no. Why so? Because if things are more than their parts, then probably if the parts are taken away one by one, then there, even when all the parts are taken away, then some remnant, some remainder should stay with us, which would account for the surplus that we talk about when we say that things are more than the sum of their parts. So so the idea here is that when we try to give definition of objects in terms of their constituent elements or in terms of their parts, then it doesn't seem absolutely correct to us to say that the object in question is nothing over and above, or nothing more than, or is absolutely identical, equivalent to its constituents or parts. The other possibility is that things, probably the object in question is more than the sum of its parts, but that also runs into problems for us. Then, the next possibility that suggests itself to us is, are things or objects less than their parts? That would be again a very absurd conclusion to arrive at. The reason being that if things, when things come together, then a part of them, after coming together, cannot disappear. Sum total, has to still remain the same. It stands to mathematical scrutiny as well. So if three things come together, 1 plus 1 plus 1, the sum of it cannot be 2. We cannot say that the sum of it could be less than the things that go on into making that sum. So, this question is probably the easiest to answer. It can never be the case that parts or constituent elements of a certain thing, certain object come together, but when they come together, the resultant thing is less than the sum total of the constituent things. So, friends, we'll talk more about this in a moment. Welcome back, viewers. So we were talking about the vagueness of things. We were talking about how, as philosophers, we are looking for a definite, clear, well-delineated understanding of the world around us, and how ordinary language doesn't seem to provide us, sufficient apparatus for that purpose. In order to prove that, we took certain examples like group nouns and so on and so forth, and from there we moved on to objects more generally. And we saw that when we talk about what we mean by the objects, what defines the objects for us, what do we mean when we talk about a particular object, what defines its thatness. Probably one of the answers that we find in the ancient texts is that it's nothing more than it's a substance, or it's nothing more than what constitutes it. It's nothing more than its constituents. It's nothing more than its parts. But there any sort of answers, if we try to find regarding the whatness or thatness of things, or the tattva of things, then each possibility that suggests itself to us in turn runs into certain issues. And therefore, the vagueness in the world seems to be an irresolvable issue. So we looked at the three possibilities. Are things identical, completely sort of equivalent, completely tantamount to their parts? The answer to that would be no. Are things more than their parts? The answer again would be no, because if we take all the parts one by one, we do not have anything remaining before us. Say, for example, if we talk about chair, could be seen as sum total of the legs, and a kind of a sort of a platform over that, and a back support. If all of these are removed one by one, then nothing remains for us. The surplus that we talk about when we say that objects are more than their parts, that surplus is nowhere to be seen. Things simply disintegrates, or sort of disappears into, so to speak, nothing. There is nothing that remains when the parts of it are removed. So does that mean that objects are less than their parts? That could not be the case either, because it cannot be the case that when you are adding up things, certain portion of those things would disappear, and it'll be one of the most mathematically absurd conclusion to arrive at. So mathematically also, it's simply not possible that things are coming together, and in the process of coming together, a part of it would be lost. If at all, it makes more sense of talking about an additional property, coming forth from the point of view of, say, for example, chemical equations. But it would make no sense to talk about, something disappearing in the process of putting things together, in the process of summing up things. So here we see that. It's difficult, if we'll start looking for an answer regarding the isness or thatness of things from the point of view of the elements, from the point of view of parts that that constitute that particular element. There are no definite answers that seem to come forth to us. So the question still remains before us as it is, which is that if the objects in the world are neither less nor more than nor identical with their parts, then how to understand them? Then how to understand the isness or thatness, or the defining feature of these objects in the world? So now the answer, that we would that Sunyavadin would offer to this question is that only answer is that we'll have to realize that things are dependently originated. Now this is an answer which is a little difficult to understand, because this basically means, for sort of understanding what we mean by this answer, we'll have to understand the meaning of pratita samutpad. So basically, the idea that Sunyavada philosopher is putting forth here is that things are, in so far as the parts that go on that constitute it, the constituent elements that go into the making of it. So far as they are there, certain thing is there, and so in a certain way, the being of a particular object, the isness or thatness or whatness, what we call tattva in Sanskrit, the tattva of a thing, thatness of a thing, is or the being of a thing or the existence of a thing is basically a borrowed existence, in the sense that it's an existence which is completely dependent upon other things that are, so to speak, sustaining it together, that are putting it together. So the thing is there so far as is the elements that sustain it are there. And in a certain way, it's not there because there is nothing that it independently has. So the defining feature of a thing would be something, or what we call swat of an object. The defining feature of the entity of an object, or of identity of an object, would be something that is identical to it. There's something that sort of constitutes its identity, meaning something that it independently has as its own. But according to Pratita Samutpad, there is nothing that an object has which we could call as being its own. So anything, the object, the entire existence, of the object is, in the sense of Pratita Samutpad, is borrowed from, the things that are sustaining it. So, say for example, if we look at the existence of any human person, then we would see that we are sort of as persons being sustained by different elements. Say for example, each almost sort of each moment we are breathing in and breathing out. Therefore, we are being sustained. Our lives are being sustained by the air that we breathe in, and that we breathe out, and also the water we take, and also the food that we take. So our existence is being sustained by other things. So there is nothing that like I'm in that sense I'm not a person, not a being which is self-sustaining, which has an existence which is independently of my own. So in that sense, my existence, or for that matter, existence of any human being, is a borrowed existence. So our existence is we are there insofar as the elements that sustain us are there. The elements that are there are sustaining us. And the moment these sustaining elements are not there, our whole sort of lives, our identity, our sort of our thatness, what we are, that would fall apart. So, so the point here is, the kind of answer that Mahayanists offer in answer to what constitutes the thatness of things, or what exactly is the nature of things. The answer would be that they are dependently originated. They come into being, depending upon certain other things, and in that sense, there is nothing absolute, about the objects in the world. There is nothing, which is independently its own, about any object in the world, which includes us, that is, the human persons as well. So things are, and in a certain way, are not there at the same time. What would it mean? It means that we are there, but we live a fleeting existence. We have a certain kind of fleeting existence, in the sense that each moment our existence is a borrowed existence. Each moment our existence is existence sustained by something that is external to us, and therefore we are dependently originated, and so is everything in the universe. So far as things are dependently originated, they are there, but they are not there in the sense that there is nothing in them which we could call their own. So this is how Mahayanists and Buddhist philosophers in general seem to be taking a middle path when it comes to metaphysical questions like what constitutes the tattva, or the thatness of things. So this is called this is what we call madhyama pratipada, middle way. Sort of an understanding of things where we avoid both the extremes. So according to the doctrine of dependent origination, things are in a certain sense, so far as we look at them as as arising out of other things, they are not there insofar as things do not have a swabhava of their own, meaning to say things do not have anything which could be called its own. So this is how sort of Sunyavada philosophy tackles the questions, certain metaphysical questions. For example, ontological questions like what do we mean by the existence of something, by the being of a thing, and so on and so forth. So one of the basic focus points here is that Shunyavadins seem to keep the vagueness of things alive. According to them, there is hardly any way to completely get over the vagueness of things. That vagueness also constituted by the fact that things as we see them, as as it stands to observation, things come to go. things come to pass, something, this is, put forth in Buddhist philosophy through their doctrine of what we call Sunyavada, through the doctrine of momentariness. Things are momentarily there. Things are in a perpetual flux. Things are changing constantly. So things, things seem to come into being depending upon certain external factors, and they pass out of existence when those sustaining factors cease to be there. So therefore, there is nothing definite about the world. There is, nothing where which could be seen as, anything eternal in the world. There is nothing that that completely defines the world. Only thing that we find in the world is that it's in a perpetual flux, that it's in a state of it's in a state of constant fleeting, coming and passing of things. So now the next question that our common understanding of things might present us with is that if the world is vague, if the world is fleeting, like the way Buddhist philosophers suggest, then why is it so that we don't understand it that way? Why is it that we ordinarily we always seem to understand, seem to look at the world, seem to view the world in an entirely different way? So what could be the reason for that? So the question here is, if the world is vague, then why is it not understood in this way? Why is it not understood as such? Now the answer from the Buddhist point of view would be that probably because this happens because we understand the world in language. So now the next question would be, what is it about the language that hides the vagueness of the world? For that, we need to understand the relationship between the language and the world. But we need to understand the first answer of coming from the Mayan philosophers first. So the answer to the question, why, if the world is vague, then we don't view it as such, the answer probably would be that the world is grasped in language. What do we mean when we say that? So the point to understand here is that it's very difficult for us to imagine any kind of understanding which is not ingrained in language. Say, for example, even when I'm talking about Buddhist understanding of the world, to convey it across to you, I'm using language. What other way could be there? What can we think of any other way? Probably not. The sharpness of this question becomes even more incisive when we consider the fact that now more and more researchers in the science of linguistics are suggesting that consciousness is completely probably consciousness and the understanding that we have in consciousness is nothing more than language. So, in a certain sense, consciousness of things, understanding of things could be completely reduced to language function. So, language function, the functioning of language, could completely account for understanding of the world. So if that were to be the case, and also, another point that probably we could take into consideration here is that there's not, something that the science of linguistics is now arriving at. Even some of the other ancient philosophers also seem to suggest that answer. So we could talk about the famous philosopher, grammarian Bhartrihari in this context. So Bhartrihari was also of the view that there could be no jnana, there could be no understanding of things over and apart from language. So according to him, the end of language is the end of consciousness. So consciousness and things, language and things have the same beginning and the same end. So the realm of consciousness, realm of the physical world, realm of linguistic understanding, they are all coeval and coterminous. So the limits of language in that sense are the limits of understanding the world, and also in that sense the limit of the world also, because apart from like the linguistic understanding of it, what the world is we don't know. So any sort of any imagination of the world apart from the linguistic realm would be just kind of positing it without ever able and there wouldn't be any way of proving whether the world posited as extra linguistic is there or not. We would never have a way of finding that out. So that would mean that language, consciousness, and the world are in that sense coeval and coterminous. The limits of language in that sense would be the limits of the world. But that so to speak goes contrary to the kind of view that Sunyavadan philosophers seem to suggest. According to Sunyavada philosophy, it's exactly the contrary. The world is, the world is fleeting. The world is in a constant change, whereas the language, has some kind of, sort of language works through fixity. Language works through reification, hypostatization. So language, can never capture the reality about the world. The reality about the world is that each moment is different. Therefore it cannot have any definite nature. There is nothing fixed about. There is no fixity about the world. Therefore, we cannot, we cannot have a definite understanding of it. So, to understand why language seems to present, the linguistic understanding of the world seems to present the world as non-vague, we have to understand how, the language functions, or how, what kind of language. What kind of relationship language bears with the world around us. So now in order to understand that, we need to understand that we need to examine the role of language more closely. So if you look at the language, the way language functions, we'll find that language is, the main reason why, we don't see the impermanent nature, the fleeting nature of the world. So language seems to hide the impermanence of the world, from us. Why does it happen? Because the language seems to suggest, say for example, what do we know of this object called chair? The term chair is just a kind of linguistic sign. It's a kind of a token, that we use to signify a particular object. And this token has, so to speak, nothing essential about it. It's not that this object, which on Sunyavadan account is completely vague. We signify it by the term chair. The term does not have anything essential about itself, to signify this object, in the sense that there could be several other ways. We could have probably used a different sound, to signify the same object. As a matter of fact, since we know that there are numerous languages in the world, and most languages would have a different word, a different token, a different sign to signify, say for example, this object before us, namely chair. Therefore, it stands to reason that there is nothing essential, absolutely essential, about any of those linguistic signs or any of those linguistic tokens, any of those sound tokens, which makes it absolutely essential to signify that object through that sound pattern. So what we mean to say here is that language is just basically it instead of capturing, having any connection with the object that it claims to signify, what it does, it immediately triggers off a conceptual scheme in our mind. So, language, if you look at its working closely, it has hardly anything to do with the physical world. This point also could be understood, by the fact that in any case, the object is physical in nature. Whereas, if you look at the language, it's an abstract. It's a system of signs, and signs have nothing, so to speak, concrete about themselves. Signs are mere abstractions. So, from something that is abstract to something that is non-abstract in nature, namely the physical objects in the world that these abstract signs seem to, claim to signify. This seems to be a huge, jump, which doesn't seem to be philosophically warranted. So therefore, language, from the point of view of philosophy, beyond a particular point, when we take certain metaphysical questions, high order metaphysical question into consideration, it seems to fail utterly, in helping us to answer those questions. The reason being that the language essentially works with the process of hypostatization, or the process of reification, which basically means seeing something abstract as concrete. So, all the conceptual schemes that, these linguistic signs trigger off in our mind, so that we put an object into consideration, that is under consideration, into a certain conceptual scheme, so that we form some kind of understanding of it. So language, works through the process of reification and hypostatization in order to help us to make some kind of, sense regarding this world. But language being abstract, cannot be in any absolute terms related to concrete things. So therefore, even though it seems to denote, things, physical things in the world, but there cannot be any, real connection between the linguistic signs and the actual objects in the world. And since this gap remains ever open, and there is no way to finally and absolutely fill up this gap between, the abstract linguistic signs and non-abstract physical objects. Therefore, language, can never, with a desirable degree of clarity, it cannot reveal the world of objects to us with certain degree of absoluteness, a certain degree of absolute clarity about it. Therefore, Sunyavadins, capitalize on this gap they point out between the way language works as a tool for the understanding of the world, and how this tool helps us in creating some kind of a workable understanding of the world. But when we start taking metaphysical questions into account, this kind of temporary understanding of things, which pragmatically, from the point of view of from the pragmatic point of view, seems to work, but from the point of view of from the philosophical point of view, that we call paramarthik satya. From that point of view, this the language, the way it functions, does not seem to provide us sufficient ground, sufficient tool to capture the reality of the world. So friends, in the next lecture we'll talk more about the philosophy of Sunyavada, the school of Buddhism. For the time being, thank you.
With this note, thank you so very much for giving us a very, very precious session. And dear friends, if you want to give your feedback for this particular lecture, then you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. This lecture is going to be uploaded for you on YouTube very soon. So keep watching us and keep writing us. We would be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you so very much.